Great. Well, so we have a question for you guys. Great to see you both. And obviously, yeah, we love the work that you're doing with Black and Green. And we were wondering, you know, if we were talking a lot about these intrinsic values of things like joy and beauty. And we were wondering how much that features in the work you're doing, bringing people out into natural spaces, and yeah, what place does that play with your work?
Wow. I think this is something that when we began the project, Jazz and I am pointing like you beside me, when Jazz and I began the project, I think, so both of us come from very arty backgrounds. As much as we're like researchers and social scientists, Jazz is a musician, I'm a writer. So we come from very creative backgrounds. And I think, well, for me at least, going into a project like this that seems very kind of hard and fast, cut and dry, I think there's always a worry that the artist has to step back, the creative person has to step back for the social scientist and the research and the serious person to kind of come forward. But I think very early in the project, working with our communities and you know, communities alongside ours, we found that actually we have to leave the beauty, the flavor, the culture, kind of that this is how these communities live. Like we had to. And I'll give you an example of food. We're talking about food. So neither Jazz nor I are Somali, but the biggest community of Black people in Bristol right now is Somali people. So we thought, okay, we have to get Somali, the Somali community into the conversation with us. Now, this is again because it's such a big community here. They deal with a lot of research, people coming in to research them. So quite often, if you go to kind of one of the Somali centers, they're not that quick to pick up on you. But they told us, you know, they said, look, if you want to get into the community, come to dinner, right? Come and have a meal with us, break bread. And I think this, again, is those things that you say, it's intrinsic, but you learn it along the way. You know, and we don't think about it because we're coming from an angle where we think it's supposed to be serious or whatever. But actually, we learn we cannot do our project at the grassroots, at the community level, if we don't keep that color and that flavor in it.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's like being aware that you're doing these things with like real people. And I think sometimes when academics or people do research, you kind of forget, oh, these are people, not numbers and facts and figures and stuff. And we always made it a massive point to make sure that we were like coming to people and being on their level and coming to people with authenticity and making sure that we were doing things in the way that we would if we were just going to meet anybody else. You know, if you're going to make friends, if you're going to ask something of someone or you know, you would build up a proper relationship first. You wouldn't just go straight in and be like, yeah, I'm just going to walk into your house and sit at your table and speak to your friends and family as if they're my mates, because that's just not how it goes. So that element for us was so important. And you mentioned there, Abby, about the word joy. I think for us, when we were talking a lot to people about how they interact with like green spaces, that the idea that, you know, you go to the park or you go for a walk in the countryside, for a lot of people, that was just kind of like, it needed to be an event, an activity that had something attached to it. You can't just go out and just do nothing. Like you normally go out with a purpose. And for us, we wanted to really reiterate, because we were told this by people in a workshop that me and Zakiya did, and they said, you know, sometimes we feel like go into the countryside, there's nothing to do. So for us, that element of joy, especially when talking to people about how you interact with natural spaces and green spaces, is so important, because that's how you learn. It's like when you're in nursery and you're learning things for the first time, they take you to the playground and they show you stuff and you ask questions about what's going on, what you're looking at, and play games to learn stuff. So yeah, joy, massive, really important part of it, and authenticity and meeting people on their level, like just normal people.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both so much. And we're excited to hear more from you both now.
Thank you. This is so weird, isn't it? We're just online in our rooms.
Cool. I like it. So it's me and you, Jazz. I guess you should start. Tell us a bit about the project, Jazz.
Yeah, so Me and Zakiya are from the Black and Green Project, which is it's a number of different things. Essentially, we are here in Bristol to challenge people in the environmental sector and the sustainability sector on diversity. You know, we want to make sure that people are aware of who is around the table when people are talking about these issues. So that's what we do. That's like the sort of premise behind what we do. But how did we start? We well, back in, I think it was 2015. Now it feels like so long ago. Bristol was awarded Green Capital of the Year for Europe, and in response to that, Bristol had loads of events, and they wanted to really put on a platform and bring to light all of the great sustainability projects that were happening in the city and all of the amazing environmental projects happening in the city. And Ujima Radio, which is a community radio station me and Zakiya work at, they were invited into these conversations, and we went around and we were speaking to people and listening to what was happening. And halfway through that event, some of the main events that happened in the summer, some people from Ujima Radio had chats with an organisation in Bristol called Bristol Green Capital Partnership, and they said, you know, all of these events are amazing, people are engaging, but where are people from BAME communities? There weren't that many people there from BAME communities, and it became a very big question mark. And it turned out that it was something that no one had, you know, through no fault of their own, no one had thought about it, no one was questioning it enough. So we then decided towards the end of this summer of events to have a massive conversation and debate called the Green and Black debate about diversity in the sector and what was happening, why were certain things happening, and where was the visibility for people. So out of that conversation, the Black and Green Project stemmed from that, and we decided to have ambassadors, which turned out to be me and Zakiya. And me and Zakiya took that baton on and took on the challenge and started to talk to people in the city more and more about this, to understand why it was happening, why there wasn't enough visibility of BAME people in the sector. And yeah, the rest is history. We've been doing it for years now, and it's just every time we get asked about how did it start, I feel like I'm looking back through like a really long telescope of time. I'm just like, wow, all of that time's gone by. But yeah, that's where we came from. That's how we started, isn't it, Zakiya?
Yeah, and I mean, we started initially it was 6 months, and then we kind of got a little bit of, different organizations in the city kind of took us on for a little bit, still under the Green and Black, or at the time it was called Green and Black. Now we're the Black and Green Project. And we haven't stopped. I think up until now, we know that for the next 3 years, so we've been given big funding by lottery. And so we have 3 years. We're actually now recruiting for a coordinator, and we'll soon start recruiting for 3 more ambassadors. So whereas it started off as me and Jazz kind of figuring out our way, actually, and I mean, that was, as Jazz said, that was 2016 and 17 while we were working officially, but we have never stopped actually doing the work because there's just such a need for it in Bristol, and I mean, across the country, there's just such a need that there's so much work that we have to be turning it down now to focus on the project and not only focus on the kind of the external things. So as Jazz said, there are many ways that we did the project. So there was one way where we were challenging the structures as they were, the institutions, the movement as it is, and Bristol is a good city for that because we are a very greeny city. It's everything. It's the city of sanctuary. It's kind of, we get everyone here who is kind of cool, rebellious, and all about human rights and stuff. So we thought this is a perfect place. If it works here, it can work elsewhere, right? And so while we did a lot with dealing with the city council, Green Capital Partnership, Greenpeace, different organizations, we actually turned inwards to the community as well. So we had, and again, it was these elements of joy and creativity that we started with in our first set of projects. So we did, as Jar said, we did workshops in community spaces where we kind of just got people together and we spoke to them about the issues, very basic. But then we also had different forms of research, which again, it was about engaging people because, you know, I like to say that when climate change and climate justice and the environmental movement was about snow leopards in the Arctic and, you know, melting ice caps, like absolutely that stuff is important. But for me at home right here, who's worrying about my next meal, like I cannot worry about that. But I will probably be interested if you tell me that the food that I buy from the local shop down there, the price is rising because the country where it come from, there's drought, they can't, you know, so we found ways to connect things to people. So it would be closer to heart. And so one of our, I would say, was probably the flagship project of our time, of Jazz and I's time, was the Photo Voice project. And Photo Voice was where we either gave people cameras or we asked them to use their own kind of cell phones or whatever. And we had a few different iterations. And I think the first one we started off with was just very simply, tell us what you like in your community, tell us what you don't like in community, through pictures, visually, very simple. But what about the environment where you live? Do you like? What don't you like? And then I think we had a couple supplementary questions for people who ask more, kind of like, what does climate change mean to you where you live here? And so again, we didn't ask much except visual, give us a visual representation. And I think closer to the end of this, we'll show you some of those photos that we came up with. And so that, I think that was a flagship project for us. And again, it's because it was this element of joy. You went out knowing you were looking for something, looking for the things that you live with and you see all the time and think about it. But here was Zakiya Jazz and Ujima Radio telling you, like, actually, this stuff is very important. We want to hear it from you. And that trickled down from our project. And I said trickle down, but actually very soon in our project, we realized that there wasn't a hierarchy. And in fact, if anyone was in charge, it was me and Jazz. We had, everyone they listened to us. After a while, I think they recognized that, okay, these are the two that are out on the streets. They're the ones talking to people. They know what they're talking about. And so we did the very same thing with the Photo Voice project. When we gave people a camera, we said, look, you are the experts on your community. And it was all, you know, local spaces, and the spaces where we know worse air pollution in Bristol. You know, the people aren't expected to live as long in these areas and stuff like that. I would say, you know, the community, you're the expert. So whatever you do, enjoy it. Don't feel anyway. And then when we finish, we can talk about it. Don't worry about what looks good and what doesn't look good. And I mean, saying that and giving people that freedom, we got a lot of these photos of rubbish, right? Of fly tipping and stuff like that. Actually, it told us exactly how much that bothered people. And so we definitely, and we were all about this kind of element of joy and keeping the happiness in it, because, you know, our communities live with so much stress and trauma anyways. And we're going to them about a topic that is stressful and traumatic when we think about climate change and climate justice. And so this is how we kind of in this way brought it to people in a way that people could be happy about it.
That's right. Yeah. And that element of like going to people and making sure that they have ownership of that narrative and that we were listening to them, you know, it's for some reason to us, it seemed like such a right thing to do. It just seemed like, you know, we listen to them, you know, it's not about us. Well, you know, we're part of the community, but it's not about us. It's about listening to them and transferring their knowledge into a space that other people can learn from. But for some reason, to other people, that seemed like a really novel idea, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, yes, speak to people!" And like, you're going to the community centre to chat to people there, and everyone was like, "Oh, really? Okay, well, we hadn't thought about that." And I think in that moment, we realised how important it was just to at least be a conduit where we can help people have their voices heard and also allow other people to listen to them and create that space for dialogue, because obviously that space for dialogue was just not happening. There was this weird top-down kind of thing happening, at least in the city, in Bristol, and not a grassroots up, which is, it seems like such a simple thing, but for some reason it just wasn't being implemented and it wasn't happening in that way. So over time, we spent a lot of time just talking to people, and we spoke to people over and over again and had conversations with not just people in the community, but people in big organizations in Bristol. We sat on boards and chatted to people. We networked and chatted to people. We sat on our radio show and chatted to people. And it felt like we were just talking and talking and talking. And after a while, I kept on thinking to myself, you know, what do we have to show for all these conversations that we're having? And I think that really concerned me, because for some reason in my head, knowing that we were part of this organization called Green and Black, which is now Black and Green, and knowing that we were attached to like Ujima Radio and all these other things, I was thinking, well, they're going to want to see, you know, physical, tangible returns. So I was thinking, okay, oh God, like we don't have this amount of things that we can show for it. We don't have all these tangible things. So it took me a really long time to actually realize and come to terms with the importance of conversation and the weight that had in the city. Because looking back then, all of those conversations that we had, they were all very new to everyone, and bringing that thing to the table to everyone was very new. And now that seed has been planted in the city, and people are kind of aware of it or already aware of it and are moving forward from those initial conversations. So initially we spoke so much, and I kind of felt like, I don't know if people are going to be happy with not seeing, you know, the tangible returns from it. But in the end, it seemed like that was the most important thing to do. Two very simple things: talking and listening, you know, and that's what we did. And here we are, and people in the city are looking at things so much more differently now, aren't they, Zakiya? It's crazy.
Yeah, and I have a pretty practical example of that. So, and again, you know, I went through the same thing. We wanted to have the numbers to say what we did, and so there was a time where we both felt like this is just kind of ideology, right? So we're just talking, we're just saying things to people, but we don't actually have physical, tangible evidence of what we've done. So over that time, I think I learned that one, research, it takes a while often for you to see the things that are implemented, because it's 4 years later now, and I think it's only about 3 weeks ago, somebody on our Twitter tweeted us and said, because of you guys, I have this allotment now, right? Yeah. And I think for Jazz and I, we were like, yeah, they're waiting for the whole time. We got it, right? And then just this morning, Jazz, I saw him, like, he tweeted his peas, his harvest, and I was like, yeah, all right, we did it, you know? So we talked for so long, but there were people who were listening to us. So that when we came off radio, there were people who would say, I haven't heard you on radio a while. So a lot of times we thought we weren't, but we were. And a pretty, you know, an example of this is so Jazz and I are not new in what we're doing in the city. And I think, again, that's one thing that was early to us too, is that the conversation, the way how we talk about it has to change, because it's not that Black and Asian and minority people in Bristol and in England aren't engaged in environmental practices or sustainable practices. Actually, we probably don't even think about it that way. We don't call it that. We have a different name for it. And so it's not integrated into what we have as a movement. So you'll always hear Jazz and I talk about movement and do this because
or like green.
Right? Green, right? Because we know that there's a movement established, but you have people on the fringes, and it doesn't mean that they're not doing this work either. And so we met, and we had a very small project called At the Feet of My Elders, right? And it was small because we only interviewed one elder at the time. We never did continue it, but this one elder that we interviewed basically told us that what we are doing, he had an organization that did it 20 years ago in Bristol, right? And the thing is, it's just not recorded. But he came to the interview with photos and photos of tens of children in the countryside from Bristol. You know, the mayor, Bristol's mayor, is one of these young people. And we just never hear these stories. So I think it's important. One is that we document it and we say, look, there's how we remember things. So a collective memory is a thing, but we have to think about what's happening outside of that memory, and people are operating on the fringes or unheard, you know, these terms that Jazz and I would have used at the beginning. Now, when we don't say people don't have voices, actually we say we're the ones not listening, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's that weird assumption that, you know, people, because like when you go to a city environment and people assume that, you know, we're all living in the city, and when people look at the BAME community, they think the BAME community in a city, they don't live in a countryside, they don't have any idea, you know, of what that space is like and what it's all about, and environmentalism and all this stuff. You know, it's that perceived perception, when really people from BAME backgrounds, you know, you go to the first generation of their families that have come down here to the UK, and they would have lived rural lifestyles. They would have been growing all their food at home, and that wouldn't have been called green, and they wouldn't have, you know, made a point of saying that, you know, I'm being sustainable, growing my like plantain and all my food at home, and, you know, like it was just a normal thing. It's a normal way of life. So that generation of people, when they came over to the UK, those ideas that were just so normal in their life, they would have passed those down to their kids. The idea of like sharing stuff and using things until, you know, they've broken, and you know, being sustainable is a very normal thing, but it just wasn't, as Zakiya was saying, wasn't a movement, and it wasn't called green. It was just a normal way of life, you know. And I think it's important to be very aware of where people are coming from and what they bring with them, and not assume stuff. And I think sadly in the UK people have been assuming things, and that means that certain people haven't been at that table when people are talking about environmental issues. And that's exactly what the Black and Green Project is. We're here to raise awareness of that, make a platform and say, look, we got people here, these people are interested and eager and passionate, just as passionate as you are, about green issues. And yeah, so that's been our journey for like the last few years. But I've got I might show this video now, Zakiya. I've got some footage. Well, okay, they're pictures from our Photo Voice project, and the audio underneath it is from a focus group when I got 2 people who had taken part in a project and 2 other people who just wanted to talk about environmental issues as well. They looked at the pictures, and this is just like a snippet of conversation from those things. So I'm going to have a go at making this work.
While we wait for Jazz, I just want to say that, so she's absolutely right. So a lot of the older generation would have come over with these practices and not call them sustainable. But in the last few years, we have worked with a lot of younger people, and there is a disconnect there. So Jazz and I think it's very important for organizations all over to kind of keep in mind that younger people, especially urban, so city kids where we are, you know, if you ask them where the chicken come from, they tell you Tesco, you know. So we believe that there's a lot of work to be done with the younger generations to then reconnect young people. So Pauline has said it would be interesting to see which communities use allotments, and yeah, absolutely. We found out recently there is a group of Caribbean elders who meet not too far from where I am, and they actually have allotments. You know, how I found is I went and I saw callaloo. So callaloo is not it's kind of like a family of kale, and we eat it in Jamaica. And I saw callaloo, and I thought, I haven't seen actual callaloo leaves in England. I only see callaloo in a tin. And I just thought, where you guys got callaloo from? And I found out this group of elders, they have either an allotment or a shared space, and they grow the different things, and then they come to their group, and then they do the plants exchange. And I thought, this is, you know, they've been doing this for years in this group, and we just don't know. We don't talk about it because some people aren't shouting about what they do. And so that's what Jazz and I and the new ambassadors, we will be shouting about these things to say, look, actually, you know, don't feel like these people are left out. We're just not facing them. People can have a look at the photos.
Yeah, they can look at the pictures as we're talking.
A little bit. This is actually my favorite photo, that one that's there that says X-rated, because then you have two kind of aunties sitting down drinking tea, and it's kind of the area that we're in, you know, it's a mix of people and things. We like that type of thing.
Yeah, and in the audio you didn't get to hear, but the people who are having a chat, they're talking about, you know, urban environments, the city, and they were questioning the whole idea of, you know, what does it mean to be part of the environmental movement, and what kind of conversations do people have in the environmental movement, and what does that mean for people in the city, and they said, you know, there should be urban environmentalism should be like the main term that people use, because for people that live in the city, that is your immediate environment, that is your environment, and that should be encompassed in that conversation just as importantly as when people talk about the countryside or more open and visibly green spaces. And I found that really interesting, because then that brings into the conversation, you know, people who is owning certain spaces, how do people feel about those spaces, and challenges that whole notion of what environmentalism is. And I just thought that was really, really important. But yeah, I'll find a way to like share a link to that video somehow so that people can listen to it. I'll put it online. But yeah, it was really interesting to do those research projects actually, and it was good to have those spaces to allow people to speak their mind and to bring what those people had said to organizations and say that this is what people were saying. So now what we want to see you do is to just do the same that we've done and open up your spaces for them to talk to you and do it authentically and hire people and not just have them on your boards to advise you on diversity and stuff. And yeah, so they were, I think, our kind of like backlog and archive of what the people were saying. But the next step for us was to try and figure out how to.
I'll just pick up. So yeah, so Jazz was saying those are our kind of major lessons. Now, just tell me how much time we have left, please, someone. So I think, you know, what we would want to share, what we want people to do, and again, it was slow. We weren't sure that people heard us or were listening to us, but years down the line, I think we realized that we did, you know, we did kind of have an impact. And I think it was the value of Jazz and I literally being outside, talking to people, just hearing people out, you know. I think it really was us having a face and being there. And so Jazz and I also worked for a different community organization where we did community co-research or co-production. And I think that was a big part of what we brought to the Green and Black project, because with that project, we realized, you know, again, it was being in the streets, representation. So we look kind of like the people we want to talk to anyway. We kind of understand them. We have a cultural understanding of them. But I think for us, you know, the one message, as Jazz would say, we really believe organizations should be hiring people.
Yeah.
But then when you're going into communities, think co-production, you know, co-working.
Yeah, exactly. If you're gonna even think about building a more sustainable future, you know, you have to also take into account who is that sustainable future going to be for, and who's going to be there at the building blocks of that future. And if you're not taking that into account, then you're only going to be serving few and not everybody. You're only going to be creating a future for a certain kind of person and community and not everybody. So yeah, that was a really important takeaway that I've been reiterating to everybody whenever I speak to people. I say who are you inviting at your table to have conversations, and what does your version of a sustainable future look like? Does that include people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities? Who is it serving? So yeah, I think should we have a look at some questions?
Question. Would you consider yes, we would. We'd love to. We would bring, I think, any of the projects that we've done, we'd love to do them again. Before, it was kind of capacity. It was time, and it was the capacity and the funds to do it. So we were both volunteers at Ujima Radio. So we had a job otherwise. We're in school. I'm a single mom. So again, and these quite often are the questions that people tell us, that they're not necessarily going to tell us in a big crowd of meeting, but actually people will tell us when we talk to them outside of the supermarket or outside of the child's school. They will tell us, like, look, I have the 3 children. I'm trying to get home. I don't care about sustainability unless you tell me it's going to make the milk that I buy cheaper. And you know, the vegetables cheaper if you're going to tell me a way to make it better for my everyday. And I think organizations and institutions need, you know, like people are, especially people who are, you know, people who are living at a disadvantage. Very often we just want to get through a day, we just want to make it, we just want to survive.
Yeah, it's got to be practical, doesn't it? It's got to be practical for everyone. It's like a lot of the times when I've done presentations and talks about my own experiences as to why I'm even in the environmental justice sector, I talk about growing up and not being able to even think about those kinds of issues at that time, because my first and foremost worry was to pay for bills, pay for food and help my mom and all this stuff like that. That's what's important to people. So you can't tell people to put down those immediate needs for something else. You know, how can you tell someone to do that? So it has to be practical. It has to be something that is going to directly help people for them to want to engage on that level if you want to talk about environmental issues in that kind of way to people. So yeah, it's got to be real, right? You can't, you know, it's good to like talk theoretically about environmental issues, but who are you talking to? And again, how is that serving that person? How is it serving everybody from all walks of life? So yeah, but I would love to do that project again.
Yeah,
it felt like we could have spoken to loads of people, but it was like time and paying for bills and stuff in it. So
Jazz, one last one I think while we move on is what's next once we've hired our new people? What's next?
That is an interesting question. It's that what next is down to the ambassadors, because the project wasn't just a justice project and a project to improve dialogue about diversity in the environmental sector. It's also a leadership platform, building people who are leaders and making sure that they have people who have like got their back and they can turn to and say, oh, how do I do this? How do I do that? How do I speak on radio? How do I write this article about this thing? How do I share my message? And we're hopefully, you know, we're going to have 3 amazing ambassadors soon, and they're all going to be bringing their own versions of their stories to the table. You know, we're not all some BAME does not mean that we're all some like homogenous sort of thing that has exactly the same views. We all have different walks of life and different places that we've come from, and it's important for us to 1, portray that and represent that, and 2, make sure that their voices are heard just as much as anybody else. So they are gonna dictate what is next.
And I think the proof is in the pudding, because Jazz is now a journalist at the BBC, and last year I was writing residence for Forestry England. So we kind of showed that the project has worked in upskilling people and putting them on to the next level.